So this is going to be a radical shift in conversation because we're going to move from talking about health of dogs to health of our digital infrastructure. And so for the next half hour or so, we're going to dive in a little bit around inside the AI build out, which as all of you know, and we heard just before, is necessary to power the next wave of innovation globally, and dive deep with Ben Jenkins, President and Chief Investment Officer of DigitalBridge, around all of the challenging questions related to capital, compute, and power in 30 minutes or less. So this is going to be a little bit like speed dating on some of the most important topics of our time that I think each of them deserve an hour or a conference or more. So Ben, thanks for being with us. Just as an anecdote, Ben got straight off the flight from New York to come to this conference. So thank you very much for drinking the good French coffee and diving into some of the challenging questions that we will talk about today. Maybe just to frame a little bit the debate, all of you will be aware that AI is driving the largest expansion right now and demand for energy, compute, and digital infrastructure. It's changing the ways in which we're thinking in Europe and beyond about industrial policy, about investment flows, and most fundamentally about global competitiveness. All of this requires thinking through what kinds of cooperation are necessary as we think through what capital, capacity, and energy systems are required to really power this next wave of innovation. But in tandem to that, some of the constraints, investment opportunities, and partnerships that are necessary to really unlock the opportunity that exists right now. And so, Ben, I want to dive in directly with you because you've been building and investing in digital infrastructure for decades. Why, from your vast experience, is this moment where AI, compute power, and capital converge, why is it fundamentally different from some of the other waves of innovation that you've seen? And what's at stake for policymakers and investors right now?
Well, first of all, thank you, and thank you all for being here. I might actually challenge the premise of the question, if I might, which is, I think this is in many ways more evolutionary than revolutionary. And by that, I mean, we've always been scaling compute since the transistor was invented. And I think it's perhaps accelerating now, but if you think back even a decade ago, we were talking about algorithms or big data. And what AI really is the evolution of that combined with significant advances in computing speed and now the power that is being applied to it. So I think this is in many ways the natural progression, but the scale and the speed of it is different. And as you point out, that requires different policies, different levels of investment, and ultimately much more cooperation.
I love that framing of evolutionary versus revolutionary, because one of the things that we've seen in 2024 alone is this kind of moment of great acceleration, where actually AI uptake in Europe, for example, is actually outpacing the uptake of mobile phones in the early 2000s. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is this demand shock around access to the compute necessary to power an AI. And I want to dive a little bit deeper with you, because in the news we will have all seen all these conversations around the question of the AI bubble. Are we in an AI bubble? Is it hype? Beyond the hype, Ben, what is the real scale of AI demand on power, land, grids, and industrial capacity? And how do you, as an investor, quantify the real scale of that demand?
Yeah. Well, I think both things can be true. It can be hype and it can be real. And by that, I mean the level of focus and interest. You talked about adoption curves, and the adoption of ChatGPT, for instance, has been the fastest to 100 million users of any technology the world has ever seen. So is that hype? Maybe, but it's also real. And the scale comes from, again, the widespread adoption and the amount of computing power required to deliver the outcomes or the so-called inferences that we're all now becoming accustomed to. And we've been doing it, as you say, for 2 decades now, and we still primarily think of ourselves as digital infrastructure investors, or really owners and operators of digital infrastructure, which we define as mobile infrastructure, which is where most of us will access AI, but also the fiber infrastructure that will carry the data traffic in and out of the large data centers, which is now our largest business. And in that realm, we're also very much in the energy and power business, because that is the coin of the realm. The way data centers are talked about, the way they're dimensioned, the way the contracts between an operator and a client work are based on the energy consumption. So by extension, we are in the energy business. And so, we're thinking about this not just in kilowatts or megawatts, but now we're into gigawatts, which typically would have been thought of to serve a small city. And now you're talking about multiple gigawatts on a single site. So again, the scale of this is really unprecedented, but it is clearly within our capability collectively to deliver on this promise. And I think, we're already making great progress. And I think with better cooperation, perhaps some thoughtful public policy, we can deliver great outcomes for everyone.
So you talked a little bit about better cooperation. I'm curious to hear from you, Ben, where you're seeing the bottlenecks. And if you could bring your microphone a little bit closer so the people with the dogs in the back can also hear you.
And apologies again for my accent. But look, I think I'll give an example from the United States, which I probably know the best. There we have a patchwork of different regulatory bodies, different permitting agencies, even different electricity grids. And it is very difficult to impose a national industrial policy. And so we have made great progress really in spite of the operating environment. And it's through force of will, the sort of innovation and human ingenuity, as well as capital. But if the pace of progress is to continue and to meet the full potential of this opportunity, there needs to be much greater coordination. For instance, I know France is already a nuclear superpower. The United States has a significant installed base of nuclear plants, but we had been going away from nuclear for many decades. Now there is, again, great interest, and there are a number of different projects from large scale to the so-called small modular reactors. And just to take that as an example, to capture the full potential, we're going to need a whole new nuclear regulatory framework. Once the technology is proven and developed, obviously we can't have people just setting up their own nuclear plants all over the country. So how is that going to work? How are we going to deal with the spent fuel? These are things that need to be debated and decided at a national level. And I'm concerned that that conversation is not happening. We get proclamations about being an AI superpower, but there are a number of things that need to happen for that to occur, and I'm concerned that we aren't having the real conversations that we need to have around that.
I love that framing, and I want to double click on this question of real conversations and the fragmentation of regulatory frameworks that you talked about, because one of the things that I'm seeing in Europe is a lot of conversations around competitiveness and what is needed in order to ensure regional competitiveness. It's hard to pronounce competitiveness. What do you see as the most immediate constraints in terms of power, permitting, or grid capacity? And how are you responding to fundamentally what is a question that everyone everywhere is asking, which is where will the power come from to support digital growth, AI, and electrification?
Yeah, I think in most cases, the issue is not generation capacity. By and large, there is sufficient generating capacity. It is more often an issue of transmission and distribution. And then for the truly mega scale projects, those will increasingly gravitate to areas where there's either excess power or the ability to generate incremental power at low marginal cost. So it's easier to bring fiber to a remote site where there may be generation capacity than it is to bring the generation or bring the electricity to a site. So I think that will be sort of the order of operation. And the good thing about AI workloads is they are much more flexible than the typical cloud workloads, which are much more latency dependent. If you're working on Microsoft 365, for instance, you don't want to have a delay in accessing your files. But if you're running large language models that aren't application specific or client specific, you can be virtually anywhere. And as long as you have good fiber connectivity, that will be sufficient. So I think you'll see workloads gravitating toward more hospitable or favorable areas of the world. Climate is important as well. Low ambient temperatures are a huge advantage. So Scandinavia obviously comes to mind, Canada, parts of the United States. I think France, again, because of its nuclear generation, has the potential to be a significant player. But there needs to be the infrastructure around these so-called AI factories as well. And that's human capital, it's the fiber connectivity, and ultimately an operating environment respectful of intellectual property, et cetera.
I like that articulation, Ben, of infrastructure is not just the nuts and bolts of data centers, for example. It's also the policy environment that needs to enable this kind of innovation. You talked a little bit about the shifts from workloads and the move to transmission and distribution. How should governments and private capital actually approach these kinds of challenges and shifts? And from your perspective, how urgent it is? What do we need to be doing in order to think through this shift and also premeditate some of those shifts that are going to shape the competitiveness of Europe and beyond?
Look, I think it's absolutely essential. And of course, there are many countries who want to be AI superpowers or who want to be at least players in this ecosystem. And so it is a very competitive world. And in the case of the United States, we have a number of advantages, but some of the challenges that I mentioned could well hold us back. And I think it's imperative that officials at federal, state, and local levels understand the consequences, the stakes of this. And we have the technological capability, we have the financial capital, We just need the political will to do it. And it is not, this is very important, it is not a zero-sum game. This is not a choice between being successful in AI and leaving customers and other consumers vulnerable. We can do both. We have to do both. And the hyperscalers and primary tenants of the AI data centers have an ability and willingness to pay for power that can then be used to reinvest in our grid, in our generation capacity, and make the whole ecosystem better for all of us.
What you just shared reminded me of something that President Macron articulated really beautifully that I think has been scaled around the world now in terms of thinking through what this opportunity represents. It's something that he shared right before hosting the AI Action Summit, of this emphasis that 100% governments need to focus on misuse of the technology, questions around safety related to AI, but we also need to be focusing on the misuse of this technology. What does it mean if we miss out not only on the beneficial use, but also the economic impact that unlocking the value of this revolution could represent in France and also beyond? So looking at the misuse, but also looking at the misuse, which I liked how you articulated. It's not a zero-sum game, that many things need to go together, and we need to hold the tension between those two. And one of the things that I'm seeing right now, particularly on the misuse aspect, is a race for capital. So right now, AI demand is creating an unprecedented race for capital, from hyperscalers that you mentioned, to utilities, to infrastructure funds. Where do you see the investment opportunities in digital infrastructure and AI infrastructure specifically right now?
Well, it's really across the entire spectrum. The primary focus is on the AI data centers themselves, which are obviously the largest and perhaps most visible aspects of this. But the power, many of these sites will have on-site generation or some sort of contiguous power solution. That's very interesting. The fiber connectivity is critical. And then again, we really view the inference and application of AI being a primarily mobile-fed ecosystem. And so everything from cell towers to in-building solutions such as you have here, all of that is a potential investment opportunity. So it really is the sort of digitization, or we sometimes refer to it as the data gravity evolution that we think is driving so much investment opportunity.
So we're seeing this drive for investment opportunity, but we're also seeing regions approach this drive in a different way. And I want to kind of double click on the different regional trajectories that you might be witnessing, whether that be in the United States or Europe or elsewhere. If we look to 2030, how do you see the Europe, the United States, Middle East, and Asia positioning themselves in terms of powering and scaling AI infrastructure? And where do you see leadership in these different fields emerging?
Wow, that's
worth a conference in itself.
Yeah, that's a pretty broad question. I think there have been several conferences on that, actually, but I'll try to address it briefly by region. I think, again, the U.S. has enormous advantages in terms of its geography and its ecosystem, but we have big challenges when it comes to power. And it's spilling over now into politics. And you've seen in certain state elections recently, electricity prices were among the top campaign issues. I think there's a desire among all of the players to find solutions, but I'm not as confident that the political will exists to actually achieve it. But I think the level of innovation, the level of capital formation, all of that are tremendous advantages for the United States. I think in Europe you have a couple of advantages. Again, nuclear power. In the Nordic region, you have the lower ambient temperatures and potentially interesting energy solutions like geothermal or hydro. I think the risk here is that if you try to separate by country, you will end up with diseconomies from that. And if there could be an EU-led initiative with, let's say, centers of excellence in certain countries or hubs that are focused on the large language models, for instance, and then you could have the inference or the cloud workloads done more at the country level. I think that's an interesting model potentially. The Middle East is an interesting one. Obviously, they have access to low-cost resources, and they are making a big push to develop local large language models and AI capability. The challenge is, again, the ambient temperature is problematic. The rule of law or respect of intellectual property, I think, is also a concern. Asia, I think I'll separate into sort of developed Asia, which would include Japan, Korea, Australia. Those countries are already leaders and advancing very quickly. Different challenges in each of the countries, but I think you'll see them continue to be at the forefront. And then, of course, China has strong aspirations to be an AI superpower, and I think they have a number of advantages. Again, back to electric generation, they have tremendous capacity and potential. So far, the chips are slightly less powerful than those in the West, but really it's a function of power. Ultimately, if you throw enough power at slightly less powerful chips, you can produce a comparable result. And they also have the benefit of a tremendous number of engineers being produced each year, and the ability to coordinate policy at a national level, which is very, very powerful. So I think you will no doubt have multiple AI superpowers. And again, this doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It is entirely possible, indeed desirable, for there to be multiple winners in this AI race.
I love that articulation, and also the tour d'horizon that you just gave of the different kind of geographic specificities. And I want to dive a little bit deeper into Europe, because you talked about Europe's competitive advantage, a lot of the great projects that exist in terms of gigafactories, AI factories, HPC. In Europe, where do you see a role for transatlantic partnership in the competitive advantage of Europe?
Yeah. Look, this is a global business, and that's been critical to our growth. We have kind of coined a phrase. Americans love catchphrases, as you probably know. So ours has been follow the logos. So we do a lot of business with Microsoft, for instance. So when they want to expand in Europe or Asia, we follow them. We do a lot with AWS. When AWS wanted to go to Latin America, we found a platform in Brazil, and we've now expanded that into Chile and Mexico. So this is a global business, and with the ability now to move workloads dynamically and in nanoseconds. If there is opportunity in Europe, in France, for instance, to leverage capacity, then there can be a cross pollination of the ideas, of the technology, and ultimately even the power. And I think that will enable both countries or both continents to be more successful than standalone. The world is not an island, or there is no such thing as a fortress for AI. For it to work, it literally needs to be seamless.
I think that's definitely a great kind of line to take away in terms of there's no such thing as a fortress for AI. And I want to, in closing out, Ben, ask you to look into your crystal ball. When we look ahead 5 years, what do you see, with over 20 years of experience in the sector, as the biggest shifts that government leaders, CEOs, and academics should prepare for as AI and energy reshape the global economic order? And how fundamentally should investors position themselves to capture the value created by this transition? What are the words you want to leave us with looking into this crystal ball as we prepare for the future and shape it?
Wow, that's quite a tall order, but I would say, and speaking to my own government as much as any, I think we do need a new paradigm to think about energy policy. Historically, it has been primarily a consumer-oriented, regulatory-heavy approach. And there's good reason for that. It is absolutely essential that everyone have access to reliable, cost-effective energy. But there also needs to be an efficient framework for allocating what is inevitably a scarce or limited resource most efficiently. So in the United States, we don't really have a mechanism for allocating power in an economic way. So primarily it's done on a time-based system. You lodge a request, they get back to you in a year or two and tell you that it'll be 3 or 4 more years before you can have access to power. That is simply not an acceptable alternative in today's world, especially considering what I said before, that certain customers have an ability and willingness to pay a premium price for access. That can then enable investment in the grid and in the utility system network that we have, which benefits everyone. And so I'm hopeful that we find a path for that over the next 5 years. I think it's critical to keep up with the opportunity and the requirements of AI. It is a tall order politically because there are local and state elections every 2 or 4 years. We have federal elections every 2 and 4 years, and it's very difficult to get the political actors to think beyond the next cycle. But that's really what we need to do if we're going to reach the full potential of AI.
Ben, thank you so much for leaving this conversation on a hopeful note. I take with me a lot of takeaways, but including most fundamentally that the world is not an island and there's no such thing as an AI fortress. I love that articulation. That it's not a zero-sum game, that there will be multiple winners, and that we need this new paradigm shift, an efficient, innovative framework to make sure that we can collaborate cross borders and cross-sectorally to unlock the value that this moment and also this AI opportunity represents. Thank you for being with us straight off the plane today, and thank you for the inspiring conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.